Welcome to Thrive Deeper, an ongoing conversation with Dr. Matthew Jacoby, author of the Thrive Bible Reading Guides, teaching pastor, and leader of the Psalmist band Sons of Korah. Join us as we go deeper into the Bible, discussing the passages as we read them together with Thrive. Now here's your host, DJ Payne.
Hello and season's greetings. We're releasing this right in the middle of the Christmas New Year period, and it is episode 29 of Thrive Deeper. It's DJ Payne here for Matt and myself, and wanted to let you know that in this episode we cover some questions about the book of Esther that we've just looked at. We go a little bit deeper in some of the more tricky territory, and then we head back into Ezra, and we deal with a very troubling area for a lot of people when we read it today, is Ezra and his obsession with divorce. What is that all about? Well, we're going to get into that in episode 29. You're about to hear it. So sit back, relax, pop open that Bible, and jot down some questions as we go. I'll be back at the end of the discussion to let you know how you could help us, especially during this time of giving at this time of year. All right, thank you so much for tuning in. Let's get into the discussion.
If I'm going to talk to you, you have to be recording.
I don't talk for anything less than while the recording's on. All right. Okay, we are doing episode 29. Recording this in middle of Christmas time.
We are, just before.
Yeah, and Christmas time 2018. Christmas almost upon us.
It is. A couple of days away.
Yeah. Are you ready?
I don't do much of the getting ready for it.
What do you do? What are you responsible around for Christmas?
General inspiration. I don't know.
You're not responsible for anything, are you?
I'm present and available.
Now are you preaching? I am.
I'm on Christmas Day. Yeah.
Christmas Day preaching? Yeah. Christmas Eve?
Yeah, both services. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
same service for both?
Yeah, same. Pretty much the same. Yeah.
Nice.
Both campuses, so that'll be good.
Busy.
And then a bit of a break for me until late January. And then I'm on late January, and then I go over to Israel for a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And
when you say a bit of a break in January, you're talking about your commitments to church.
Church, just from the preaching side of things. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And then I heard a rumour that, I know it's a long way away, but I heard a rumour that later in 2019, you've got a long service leave. Is this true?
Yeah, we're looking at taking the kids over to Europe actually for a few weeks.
What are we going to do here? What's going on?
I don't know. We'll get ahead.
We'll have to do some recording. I'll get you on Skype from over in Europe.
That's right.
Taking the family over to Europe. What a world of luxury.
Yeah, I know. It feels like it. I don't know how we're going to afford it. Anyway.
Dear. Okay, now in this episode, we've got a bit to cover. We've over the last week we've gotten back into the book of Ezra, and we've finished off Esther. But there's been some questions pop up for Esther.
For
Esther. The last 2 weeks we've covered the book of Esther, and we really flew through.
Have we not answered everyone's questions?
Well, it's amazing that people have more questions. And we really did fly through those 2 episodes of Esther, because even rereading it again, I ended up rereading it again. I was like, man, there's so much more in this book that we didn't even cover.
Yeah, it's great.
But, okay, so two questions came about the 2 main women in the book. The first one being Queen Vashti.
Yeah, Queen Vashti.
Yeah, some questions came out of Queen Vashti. Some people said, why did she refuse her king?
Yeah.
And what was she actually refusing?
Yeah, well...
so getting back to the story... King Artaxerxes?
Xerxes.
King Xerxes.
Xerxes the first.
Is having this massive celebration.
That's right.
He's drunk with all of his friends.
And he wants to get his trophy wife out to show her off in front of everyone. Vashti, who actually we don't know of from other, because we know a bit about Xerxes from historical documentation from the time. We don't know of Vashti, but it could have been a kind of a alternate name, because names are a little fluid at this time, and people are known by different names. However, why did she refuse? Look, it seems like she's having a party, her own party, not because she was banned necessarily, because the women were banned from the main party, which is curious, because that they would do these things together, but it's already curious that she's having her own party alongside the king. So already there's like, that's a bit of an issue, she's having a little breakaway thing already going on there. So that may have something to do, it's some pride thing on her part.
Okay.
She doesn't, and probably understandably, she doesn't want to come out and denigrate herself before the king's drunk mates.
Yeah, well, I read two things. I went looking for, as I do, down my rabbit trails for this, and like you say, there's not a lot known. I think I read one that the rabbinic, the Jewish tradition, is that she was a daughter of the Babylonians. She was like a trophy, like you say, a trophy wife. She was like, the last, he took her as a trophy from the last, family, dynasty. And I thought that was interesting. There's no historical proof for that at all, but it sort of gives you a whole, cultural thing. But then the other one that I read was a little bit more, based in historical facts and stuff like that. And they were saying that it was common for these kings type of thing. When he was saying bring the wife out to show, they were saying some of the writers were like, oh, this is parading around naked in front of, like, there's a whole, level of degradation that we don't sort of see in the innocent way that we read it today.
Maybe. I mean, it's hard to. I don't know where you. What is it that you read? Like, where do you get this stuff?
I find some great commentaries out there.
I'm reading proper peer-reviewed scholarly material, and a lot of that sort of material that I'm using is a little more modest in.
Yes.
And so things like that, look, it may be the case, but certainly there's something. It seems like there's something that is to that level of degradation.
Yes, yeah.
And so she is refusing that. In terms of, I think it's worth saying too, in terms of, the traditional Jewish commentary on the Old Testament, of which there's a whole body,
myriad,
going back to ancient times, that develops over time, and look, not a lot of it. It's of interest, and some of it has some warrant, but it's tradition. It doesn't always have a lot of historical support for it. But it is interesting because it shows how stories were regarded, from that from the earliest times. But there's all sorts of interesting things, including, because we're going to look at Ezra in a moment. According to Jewish tradition, to give you an example, Ezra was kind of inspired by God to rewrite the whole law because it was lost at some point.
Wow.
During the in the destruction of Jerusalem, and then he was inspired, according to one sort of stream of Jewish legend. I mean, I think that's a little unlikely, but that's the sort of thing that
pops up.
That pops up in Jewish
and
legend.
it was funny. And then I went as running through this whole Vashti universe. There's around the person. There's a whole string of people who've taken her as a very like a feminist icon. Over the years, both Christian and non-Christian,
right.
Of all different walks type of thing, Jewish and
right.
Gentile, have gone, oh, let's look, she's a feminist icon, she was, because some people believe, she was actually martyred for the cause, standing up to the husband. And I was like, man alive, it's fascinating, just these little
quite
things.
Validly, she doesn't want to be objectified and paraded around like that, so that's fair enough.
Okay, so jumping to the next question that came up was about, and we really skimmed over this one. Listening back to it, I was like, did we even touch on this one? We really skimmed over this part of the story. The whole campaign for a new wife for the king and Esther's role in that.
Yeah.
Being set aside for 12 months to be prepared and then having one night with the king and seeing who is pleased the king the most. We really skimmed over that.
Yeah, we did, didn't we?
And a lot and people were pretty much going, hang on, is the Bible sanctioning premarital sex? Is this a sexual relationship going on here? What's going on?
No, hang on. The Bible isn't condoning anything here.
This is the question.
Okay.
These are the questions.
Because, if you want to go there, then okay, let's look at everything that Xerxes, the Persian emperor, did, and let's do that.
Yeah.
No. Actually, and I think this is part of the point of the story, because again, one of the mistakes I think that's made about the Book of Esther is it's treated like a kind of fairy tale, like the king is looking for a new wife, and it's like Cinderella or something like that. Well, actually, no, it's not, and it's far actually from being romantic, because basically. To find a wife, beautiful young women were basically abducted from all over the empire and locked up in the king's harem, and he was going to find her. Well, they didn't have any say in this, So for Esther, this isn't a good thing. Oh, isn't this wonderful that this has happened to me? And she's a Jewish woman who would have wanted to stay with her people, practice her customs, worship God. Instead, she is snatched off into the harem of a pagan king. But this is the last thing that she wants. So the whole point of the story is how God works his perfect will through otherwise really terrible things. It's a great illustration of Romans 8:28, which says, and God works all things for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose. Because what you see is that Esther becomes a crucial part of God's purpose, being in the right place at the right time. But nevertheless, all of the things that are happening around her are terrible things. So there's a 3-year process where he selected these. So she's in this harem for a long time. She's, she can't have contact with her family. Mordecai is her family. You notice he's always at the gates and she's having to send messages to him.
Back and forth.
Yeah, she can't have contact with her own people. She's locked away, So this is not a great situation. And yet life isn't just about us. It's about a bigger purpose. And her being where she was saved the Jewish people from complete genocide. Talk about, and this story of Esther is a story about how God was faithful to his promises. But he is working all things for the good of those who love him. But it means that sometimes we find ourselves in tough situations and we don't like it. But life's not just about us. It's about what we need to be for other people. And this, I think, is the significance of this story. So I think it's a good example of don't look at everything that happens in the Bible as though this is an example to us of how we need to live our lives, right? Oh, he had a harem. Does that mean that we can have lots of... no. And, you could even apply that with Solomon, where, Solomon had many, but look what happened to him, So you shouldn't read, these stories aren't, stories to illustrate to us how we should live our lives.
No.
The point of the biblical story is to show how God is faithful in and through everything, even expressions of outright evil.
And it's funny, when those questions came in, I sort of reread those parts again in Esther with a totally different look in my mind. Like, again, I think I've been guilty of making it into some sort of, not so much a Sunday school story, but more of those classic 1950s, 60s films of like, the Middle East, isn't this exciting? And these harems and stuff like that. And it's like, no, like this is a girl abducted, a girl held against her will, who, when the time is right, according to her keepers, because it goes on about the eunuchs who are keeping them, and 2 different harems, those who are in preparation to see the king. And then once they've been had by the king and he's had their way with them, they get moved into the other harem to see if they'll ever be called back again. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And in my mind, I sort of reread it as almost like a horror story. Like a horror story that this young innocent is taken before like this incredibly godlike character in the scene, who is just wicked. He's not a great guy in the story, And the miracle that I reread is, and it sort of makes it a really big point of saying, is that somehow Esther captured his heart. You know what I mean? Like whatever that means, you know, that somehow, like, it's that old thought again of God, you know, controlling the hearts of the kings. You know, like and it's that's part of the story.
Yeah, she found favor in it. And it's, it is totally, I mean, a similar situation. Remember the story of Naaman the Syrian, you know, that during the time of Elijah or Elisha, is it? Where he comes to Israel and he has this amazing experience of healing. Do you remember how he came to hear about
from a slave
girl?
Yeah,
you know. And so here is this amazing thing that happens, you know, where this foreign general has this encounter with the power of God, and it's through a girl who was taken as a slave, you know, and. You see this, you know, again and again. I mean, even in Christian history, they say that a lot of the Nordic countries actually were Christianized by the slaves that they took from Christian countries.
Wow.
That's actually how the gospel spread into those areas. You know, so, I mean, and it's not to downplay how bad, you know, the enslavement and the abductions, and including this situation in Esther. It's not to underscore how bad. In fact, the badness of the situation highlights there's truth that in and through all things God works out his perfect purpose, paradoxically, you know.
Yeah.
I think there's a really profound lesson in that.
Oh, I cannot tell you this week how much God has, the last couple of weeks, a story I have read 1,000 times, you know, give me a quiz, I'll answer it, I'll get 100% on the quiz. And God's like, dummy.
Well, you know,
like,
I know. Me too.
This is for you now.
Yeah, me too. I seriously, I even bothered whether I would read this story because I know, to be honest.
Same. I'm like, what is going on?
Should I bother to read it again because I knew it so well? And the thing that stood out to me about the story of Esther was the hiddenness. You know, there's a rendering of Esther's name. I mean, you could mean Ishtar, but in a sort of Hebrew rendering, I read somewhere, you know, it can be, I should have studied up on this part more with a little Hebrew that I did study. But, you know, this idea of hiddenness. Yeah. And we talked about how, you know, the name of God is never mentioned. I mean, it's like, is God even in here? Yeah. And what highlighted to me, I think I saw that really as an amazing literary technique. You know, the writer is actually of Esther is calling us to actively recognize where God clearly is at work, because the outcome is the fulfillment of so many of the strands of covenant promise in this story. I mean, it's amazing. Clearly God is, and yet it's not obvious and evident. And I guess what this has meant, I mean, this is really how this has spoken to me, is that God doesn't just pop into my life in an interventionist way to he's involved in every aspect of it, right? He's involved all the time, right?
Yeah.
And we can make a mistake of just saying, oh, God's not involved in my life, because we're too busy looking for those massive, obvious acts, miraculous, obvious acts of divine intervention, you know. But God isn't an interventionist God, he's an ever-present God. Yeah. And it's actually, that has really impacted me, that idea. I get too busy looking for real obvious, I suppose, manifestations of God, when clearly, you know, like with Mordecai at one point, he just knows God is going to be at work in this somewhere. Yeah. And he just assumes that God is at work in the placement of Esther. It's like, you need to assume that God is at work in your life and like live according to that, like trust in the providence of God.
Nothing's out of his control.
Listen to what God is saying to you through anything and everything that's happening, and tune into that.
From the drunken, lustful heart of the king of the world through to the rolling of a dice. Yeah. In the
Purim, rolling of the Purim, the lots.
And everything in between.
God works through
I've got it under control.
Absolutely. You know, so it's not just in the obvious things, it's in everything that God works. And, you know, I think that's an amazing idea, you know, that you recognize that God is involved in everything, absolutely everything. That, I think, is a beautiful thought.
Let's move into Ezra. All right.
Yeah.
We've this week we finished off Esther.
Yeah. So, meanwhile,
Yeah.
back in where go to the west.
Now, something that I realised in rereading everything and going through all the material over the last couple of weeks that I've really taken away was that meanwhile back in Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the remnant. The majority of the Jewish people were still living abroad. They were following what Jeremiah had told them to do. The prophet Jeremiah said, settle down in Babylon.
Yeah.
You're going to be there for a while.
Plant crops,
Make
build
yourself
houses.
home.
Yep.
That's it. Establish yourselves. And they did.
And they did. And prospered, I may say.
Yeah, and did exactly. We're seeing what's happening with Esther and all, Mordecai and the Jews all around in all these different provinces around the world. The Jews are spreading out. Meanwhile, this little remnant are going over there, and it's such a remnant that we have a big point here in Ezra. Is that when Ezra's finally on the scene and he's trying to get things going for the temple, he's like, guys, we don't have enough Levites on the scene.
Yeah.
There's not enough people coming back, and he has to muster up more people to come back.
Yeah, that's right. He does have to do that.
In my mind, I sort of had it the other way around. I was like, oh, yeah, all the Jews are wanting to go home. Yay.
Yeah.
Not at all.
Yeah, because we've just looked at the story of Esther, and of course, Mordecai becomes basically the second in charge over Persia. And we saw that with Daniel. Both Ezra and Nehemiah occupy really important positions, actually, in the Persian Empire. So, the Jewish people are doing quite well. This does stir up lots of anti-Semitism at the same time. So it's kind of a polarizing situation. It's like God blesses them, and they ascend to positions of great authority, and then we get these waves of persecution as well, as seems to have always been the case.
It's still going on today.
But it is important to recognise that it's just a remnant that comes back, and this is where we pick up in Ezra. Chapter 7, which comes back, meanwhile back in the land. And of course, it's not as though, we've paused between chapter 6 and 7 to go look at the book of Esther.
And that's between the story of Zerubbabel and Ezra.
Yeah, that's right. Because
which is a big gap.
There is a big gap. So we left the story with the completion of the temple, which was in 515 BC. And that's where we get to at the end of chapter 6 of Ezra. Chapter 7 brings us to 548 BC. So you're talking about a lapse of about 57 years between Ezra 6 and 7. We don't know what happens during this period. We don't have any information. The only reference we have is from Ezra 4. Now, in Ezra 4, he's talking about opposition, and as an example of opposition, in Ezra chapter 4, the writer of Ezra gives us an example of opposition by harking forwards, actually, to something that happens during this period.
Okay.
That isn't really recorded anywhere else. It's alluded to, possibly. It's behind here. But that's Ezra 4:6, when Artaxerxes, the governors of Samaria, this area, they write back and say, hey, these guys are, they look like they're getting, building, and Artaxerxes sends a letter back saying, stop them from building.
Yeah.
So the temple has been built, but this is as they look to start building their city.
Yes.
And this is one of the reasons why when Nehemiah gets there, they haven't done anything, partly because in that intervening period, they have started, but this letter has come through, don't let them do that. And that actually may have meant that they tore down what they were building as well.
Okay.
The neighbours. So that's kind of something that you have to put a few pieces together to get that.
Yeah, because the book of Ezra, obviously Ezra and the team who were putting together that book, originally one book with Nehemiah, one whole story.
Yeah.
Chronological storytelling is not important.
Yeah, so there's a thematic thing in those early chapters, like in Ezra 4, where he's talking about the opposition to the building of the temple. Yeah. He then gives an opposition to the rebuilding of the walls.
Yeah.
That is actually before the time of Nehemiah.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it
doesn't make sense.
So that's the only thing we know about that 57-year period that they did. They tried to get going on rebuilding the city, the walls itself, but that was thrown out because of this edict from the king.
Okay.
Which actually, as when we get into Nehemiah in next episode or whenever, that actually underscores the boldness of Nehemiah in asking, in requesting from the king that he can go back and rebuild the walls, because it's actually in opposition to a previous edict. So it's quite a miracle that he's granted that wish. So, but anyway, that highlights something later on in Nehemiah.
Okay.
So we come to 458 BC. This is when Ezra finally comes to Jerusalem. As you said, Ezra and Nehemiah were originally considered one book. It's actually only in the Christian era that they have been treated as separate books, and it's that we don't know who wrote them really, but they're certainly. In terms of their final thing, but certainly Ezra and Nehemiah, there's large sections of that are written in the first person by both of these characters. So Ezra comes to Jerusalem in the time of Artaxerxes, who ruled from 465 BC to 424 BC. Ezra has really quite an important position. Actually, it looks like he's something comparable to a Secretary of State for Jewish Affairs or something like that, you know. And so he's given the task of going back to the city, and he's given quite a lot of authority actually when he goes back. He's in Babylon. Nehemiah is going to come from Susa, which is further east.
Yes.
But Ezra's still in Babylon. So he's sent back on this journey. At this point, the policy of Artaxerxes to, and this is going to be the same under Nehemiah.
Yes.
To show this kind of favour is probably partly due to the fact that there's lots of activity going on in the empire, lots of threats, and he needs to secure the loyalty of certain elements of his empire.
Do you think there's anything to do with Mordecai and Esther being...
I think it could be. Yeah, it certainly could be. I mean, in fact, I would assume it is from that. But remember, that's in the previous generation. That's in the time of Xerxes.
Yeah.
Now, how long is Mordecai?
Yes.
We really don't know.
No.
So, but what we do know from history is that he's got lots of problems, international problems, and so particularly down in Egypt, and he needs to secure the loyalty of the in-between areas, and this region of Samaria, which is actually the region that Judea was included in, is one of these regions. So this is why, like providentially, and I emphasize that providentially, the king is in a position where he needs to secure the loyalty of this Jewish people. Yeah. The fact that he would take notice of them is evidence of the favour of God. I mean, because he's got Ezra and Nehemiah, who are both in these official positions.
Yes.
So he feels that he can trust them. I don't think he quite the Samaritan governors down there. I'm not sure if he feels that he can really trust them, but he trusts Ezra and Nehemiah.
Yeah.
And so he sends them back to take control of this area. And I think again that's a testimony to to the favour that they found in
Yeah.
the king's eyes, the fact that they were seen as trustworthy.
So basically, Artaxerxes with Ezra has, and again, like you said, Ezra's in some sort of official position. He's some sort of expert on the Torah. He's an expert on the law. He's an expert on their customs and everything like that, on the Jewish way of life.
Yeah.
And so he is sent back really to rebuild the community more than anything, to sort of rebuild their Jewishness.
Yeah.
In this time.
Yeah, that's right.
And he's not happy when he gets there.
No, he's not. He's not happy. He's not happy when he gets there. So he prepares for this journey. He's equipped with a letter from the king. Just to step back a little bit, there's a few aspects to this letter. I mean, first of all, he authorizes any Jews who want to return. Yep. He gives a significant royal grant towards the cost of sacrifices at the temple and other expenses. Ezra, what we're going to see, he's obviously given a lot of money, and Ezra wants to he wants to ensure that we know that he stewarded that money well, that he didn't just take that for himself. So there's lots about, I entrusted it to these people, and then it was counted before, and then it was counted after. Yeah. I mean, he wants everyone to know that he did the right thing.
He kept all the receipts.
And that this went where it was meant. He kept all the receipts, that's right. There's an order to return the articles of the temple that were still in Babylon, so there was still some there, and an order to the provincial treasurers empowering Ezra to claim other supplies, exemption from taxes, and this is an important one because this is important background for understanding how Ezra can come in with such a sense of authority. I mean, who's this guy that just turns up? Well, he's empowered by the king to set up a judicial system with full powers of punishment. I mean, he's put in charge under the king, so he has full authority, and yet he doesn't actually. What you see, the interesting thing about Ezra, when it comes to what he has to face, and we'll talk about that in a moment, he doesn't enforce his authority. The way that he wields his authority, full authority, like he has the power of life and death, basically, over Jerusalem. And yet the way that he chooses to exercise this authority is really interesting. So let's just shelve that.
Yeah.
Let's
put that to one side.
Yeah.
Yep.
Remind me to come back to that because I'll forget that. So Ezra chapter 8 talks about how they assemble together at this open place. And he realizes, well, there's no Levites here. We need to, like you said before, not many people have gone back. There's so few. So many have remained. Now, the interesting thing is the fact that they find 220 temple servants that are not Levites but sort of extras to work there. These may be present servants of Levites, but then there's all of these different people that they find that still identify themselves by their traditional roles, which is really interesting. So it means that he goes looking for these families who are traditionally responsible for certain roles in the temple, and he finds them. Which means that they kept hold of this identity. Yes. Levites were Levites, and Levites with different responsibilities held on to that identity. So he goes back with all of these people, and he arrives in 457 BC, and this is where he's confronted with this issue.
It's a big issue.
Now remember, the fact that he can come back with the fact that he can come back with anyone is due to the fact that the Jewish people in exile have kept themselves distinct. I mean, they wouldn't have existed as a people group. There wouldn't be anyone to come back and sort of pick up God's purpose where it left off if they had not kept themselves completely distinct. And at this stage, so they are recognizing, man, distinctness from the nations around us is an absolutely vital aspect to us being the people of God, you know. And
I add on top of that this overwhelming sense of the previous generations got it wrong.
Yeah, that's right.
They got us exiled in the first place.
That's right. The reason they went into exile in the first place is because previous generations mixed with the nations around them and took on the customs and so forth of the nations around them, and even intermarried. I mean, the big problem, of course, with Solomon and the writer of the books of Kings wants us to see that all of the problems started with Solomon doing what, really all of the wives he had and intermarrying with these pagan women, and his heart was turned away. And it says in Deuteronomy 7, do not intermarry with them, do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods. Now, I mean, in one sense, Solomon was marrying in a more international sense,
Yes.
but the bad example is still there. So you're right. The whole problem in the lead up was they're mixing too much, and so they in their exile they really get this point, and it's quite remarkable that as a people they remain so distinct in their exile. I mean, there are plenty who would have assimilated.
Well, and that's exactly what Ezra is coming back to the people who are living there, the people who are involved in this new establishment and everything like that. He's like, hang on, you guys have been marrying the local women around you.
So this is the shock. So he gathers together all of these Levites and with all these various roles who still identify themselves by those roles. So they have kept themselves. They've kept hold of their identity. Goes back to Jerusalem. These guys are meant to be on the coalface of God's purpose. And he finds that it's like they've given up. Because the building got thwarted and it's just a bit hard, and they've like lost sense of God's purpose, and they have intermarried with the people around them. And I think this is the first mistake because a lot of people read, what's the big deal with that? Of course there's a big deal with that, because, they had survived as a people group because they hadn't done that. And so this is a really big issue. Now, one thing that's another important thing to point out is that Malachi is a contemporary of Ezra and Nehemiah.
Malachi the prophet.
Malachi the prophet, right? So he's ministering during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Probably going a bit later. He's probably overlapping later. But Malachi actually talks about the fact that the problem of divorce. Because that would seem to contradict what happens. Because Ezra, hang on, I'm mixing. I'm trying to say too much here. Let me just go back.
So what does Ezra do about it?
So let's just first of all summary before, because I'm rushing. There's too much good stuff to talk about. So first of all, I talked about the way that Ezra goes about his leadership. He realizes you've intermarried with these people. I mean, what's the point? Like, if we do this, we're lost as a people group. Like, already. It's finished. It's completely finished. We need to keep our distinctness. It's not racism. It's them understanding that we need to keep our distinctness as a people group. And at this stage, intermarriage is going to threaten that. So he sits in chapter 10. It's amazing. Chapter 9 and 10. When he finds out, he sits in the city square, appalled, absolutely appalled at this, and he's weeping and he's wearing sackcloth. It's a very makes public declaration of mourning, of repentance, and everyone's. He's an important guy. Like, he's the boss, and he draws everyone beside him. I mean, he doesn't just come down with a heavy hand.
Which he had every right to do.
He had every right to do.
He could make decrees, he could make judgments, he could make laws about it.
Instead, he sits there with his clothes torn and he prays to God publicly, and he confesses. Well, he confesses the sins of his people as though they were his. I mean, this is an interesting thing. For these people, there's no separation between my sins and our sins.
Yes.
Like, if you sin, that's my problem. In at this time. And I think there's something really, I think really valid about that idea, because he says that like, for these people who are doing this, like, you're going to mess it up for us all. right? Because God's purpose depends on us remaining distinct. So, so the people come up and they weep with him, and they join him in his act of repentance. And then they actually, it says in 10 verse 2, then Shechaniah, son of Jael, one of the descendants of Elam, said to Ezra, "We have been unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women from the peoples around us, but in spite of this, there is still hope for Israel. Now let us make a covenant before our God to send away all these women and their children in accordance with the counsel of my Lord and of those who fear the commands of our God. Let it be done according to the law. Rise up in this matter. This matter is in your hands." Okay, so Ezra actually doesn't even come up with this plan. This comes from them.
Yeah.
And look, it's a bad thing to have to do.
Horrible. Especially in the light that Malachi, like getting back to it, we've got the prophet Malachi over here saying, "Hey, everybody, God hates divorce."
Yeah, that's right.
Don't come and
God
pray,
hates divorce, right?
Don't pray to me.
I'll say something about that in a sec.
Yeah.
But first of all, we don't need to take away from the fact this is a bad thing.
Yeah.
Again, it goes that, like what I was saying before. Oh, so they did this, so that means it's a good thing.
Yeah.
It's like, it's not a good thing that this should happen. It was not a good thing that they did that in the first place, but they created this mess and they came up with this solution, right?
Yes.
They came up with this solution. And it's a kind of functions as a necessary evil. Now, the principle of necessary evil is an important ethical idea, because it's this idea when something bad is done, but it's like the best of some really bad options in that situation. So I think that's the first thing. We don't need to look at this and say that this was a good thing. Secondly, sorry, my computer's talking to me. And so yes, Malachi sort of bemoans divorce. Now, if you put these things together, what seemed to be happening was that these guys were divorcing their Jewish wives to marry pagan women. So
I'd never put the two and two together.
Because he talks about divorcing the wife of your youth.
Of your youth, yeah.
And and this is so there's a whole lot of mess going on here.
Okay.
And it is, it's bad what needs to be done. And there's about, it turns out there's about 110 people who did this. It's not thousands. There's 110 people who did that, but that's enough. This is a small community.
Yeah.
And these are leading peoples.
Yeah.
So this is a serious kind of spiritual matter. And so, these women get sent back to their families
with any children that they've got.
With any children that they've got. It's a tough situation. Yeah, it's a tough situation. Again, this is what they came up with. It's kind of this drastic thing. But notice that Ezra doesn't enforce this on the people. The people themselves recognize that this is the more preferable of the two evils.
Yes.
So
okay.
So there's a comment from a commentary that I pulled out here. It says, while we may not fully agree with the direction in which the community was taking in terms of the divorce, we may nevertheless learn from the manner in which, by teaching patience and example, this is with Ezra, he was able to bring the people without coercion to make for themselves the decision he considered beneficial, even though they might be painful in the short run. So, Ezra is accepting this. Okay, you've made such a mess here that we're going to have to do this really terrible thing to prevent an even bigger, long-term mess. Now, if you don't think the issues are serious, then you're not going to, accept this.
Yeah.
But the more serious you see the spiritual issues and the implications for the future of God's covenant people and God's plans, the more we see the seriousness of that, the more we can say, okay, it was a really bad thing, but they'd made a mess of this.
Okay.
So there was no other way to go, really.
Now, we're running out of time here. We've got to wrap this episode up as we're talking about Ezra, as we finish off the book of Ezra. Can I just say, bummer of an ending?
Yeah.
Like, this is how Ezra finishes. Like, yeah, and the men went away, and these are the men who had married. Yeah. Let's list them all. And I think the last one, each of these sent away their wives, and some of them even had kids, and that was that.
Yeah, luckily it's not the ending, because remember, it was one book.
I know, and I'm like, hang on. This is like, but we had a little bit of the same sort of vibe under Zerubbabel, where, Zerubbabel, they come back, there's these great big things.
It's the finish of a section, certainly the finishing of
and it's like, he makes this decree, and they go, and that's sort of sad. And then the next guy turns up. I'm feeling a bit bummed out as we finish off Ezra.
Yeah.
I'm not,
And the question is, again, to finish off, I mean, how does this apply? Like, I think it's worth thinking on that level. Now, it's interesting because obviously the ethnic thing, like there is neither Jew nor Gentile under Christ, so that had a role for a little while, right? Yep. But it was a temporary thing. I still believe there's a commitment that God has to the Jewish people as in accordance with his original everlasting covenant, but the ethnic thing isn't the thing anymore. However, Paul does say in 2 Corinthians 6, do not be yoked together with unbelievers, for what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light and darkness have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? So this idea of yoking yourself to someone whose walk is going in a complete life direction, that principle is still carried through from the Mosaic law into the New Testament. However, I think it's also important because a lot of people say, what about, because in the early church, as is today, lots of, for example, women were coming to faith whose partners weren't, or men coming to faith. And Paul speaks to this in 1 Corinthians 7, and this is where this changes, and I think the change is beautiful. It's like a new nuance to this law. He says, to the rest I say this, if any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her.
Love it.
Yeah, okay. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he's willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband, get this, has been sanctified through his wife. Wow. And the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah. And so I think this is a really beautiful kind of development of this. It's like this original principle that is a bit kind of harsh. It's like this gets redeemed in the New Testament law with this idea that, okay, let's not be unequally yoked. Let's not purposely yoke ourselves to those who are going in a complete life. There's an obvious reason why that could be the case. And yet, you know what? As different people come to faith, the whole thing is turned around. Don't, that one part of that relationship is sanctified through the believing partner. Such a beautiful principle. And it is just covered in the kind of grace that the new covenant exudes.
Well, I hope that helps in unlocking some of the troubling parts as we finish up the book of Ezra, especially when it comes to divorce. Now, next week we get into Nehemiah. Cannot wait to get into this fascinating book with you all. And we've always looking for your questions. But seeing that it is the Christmas New Year break, you know what's a great thing to do while you've got a little bit of time? Heading over to iTunes and finding the Thrive Deeper podcast and giving us a 5-star review. Believe it or not, this is a great way for others to find our podcast. When you give it a review, Apple features it a bit more prominently in all of its algorithms, and it does a lot and goes a long way to help us be seen by new listeners. So there's my challenge to you as you wrap up 2018. Looking forward to being with you next week on another episode of Thrive Deeper. On behalf of Matthew and the whole team, thanks for listening.
Thank you so much for listening to Thrive Deeper. We value all our listening community. If you are on Facebook, search and like Thrive Today page to get all of our latest updates. Our home on the internet is at thrivetoday.net.au. There you can subscribe to the Thrive Daily Reading Guide and contact us directly. That's at thrivetoday.net.au. Until next time, thrive.